Well, great. So we're now going to transition to our afternoon program. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Blumenthal, who is the President of the Commonwealth. So David is an amazing scholar, more than 250 articles and book chapters. He is an amazing doctor. He is an amazing thought leader. And if anybody who knows anything about health policy and healthcare knows that there's a name that's as good as gold, and that's the Commonwealth name. We're very excited to have him here, and he's going to speak. He has 40 minutes. He's going to take some question and answer, but I'm now going to invite David up to the podium.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for that very kind introduction, and I hope everyone is awake, alert, and not yet digesting their meal, so that they will be absolutely sparkling with their attention at this point. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we stand with the politics of healthcare reform and what some of the historical lessons are for the requirements that need to be in place for healthcare change to happen. And I'm speaking here not just of healthcare change that originates on the left, but also change that originates on the right. So where's the public? What do you need to make, how do you make health reform happen? And in that regard, I'm going to concentrate on one particular topic, and that is what I call the presidential playbook, because if a president does not properly use his or her authority and political capital, and if they don't know how to make this process move, health reform is unlikely to be successful. There are many conditions, but this is a principal condition. And though we don't think about this often, the fact is that there is only one elected official in the United States who at least nominally represents the whole country, and that is the president. And there is only one person who has the visibility, the bully pulpit, can garner the attention to create the political will to pass something really, really hard and controversial like healthcare, and that is the president. So that's why I'm concentrating on that particular figure. I know John McDonough probably shared with you his view of what presidents have accomplished in the past or failed to accomplish. I'm going to dig down a little bit more into some of the specific lessons that can be learned from history. But before I do that, I want to say something that I find astonishing as someone who has been in this game way too long. I won't tell you how many years, but it's many decades. There are lots of times when I was sitting at my computer, or even before computers were as prevalent as they are now, sitting at my desk, wondering why no one else cared about healthcare policy. Because it seemed to me really important. And it would surface in national debates, and then as soon as an election approached, it would kind of wither away in the face of jobs or terrorism or crime or something else that was more appealing to the American public. Well, be careful what you wish for. We now have a clear focus nationally on healthcare. And you don't have to do anything complicated to figure that out, though I will share some data with you. All you have to do is look at this, the first three Democratic debates. 90 minutes out of the first three debates spent on healthcare. 90 minutes. That's not by chance. It undoubtedly reflects, in part, the polling of the candidates. It, of course, also reflects what the media feels could divide the candidates and would create a more theatrical set of debates. But nevertheless, that is a long time to spend on any issue. Even as a health policy wonk, was ready to throw my shoe at the television by the end of the third debate. I just couldn't stand any more health care, especially the way it was discussed in those circumstances. But if you try to get a little more objective about it and ask yourself, and go to the polls and ask what motivates people at the current time, what they think the key issues are, well, the fact is that a plurality believes that health care is the top issue for the United States to deal with right now. This, of course, could change. This is data from the spring, so it may already be changing, but the debates are good evidence that more recent polls are showing the same results. So healthcare is in focus. If you probe a little bit more, what you find is that it's not necessarily the issue that people spent 90 minutes on, the candidates spent 90 minutes on in the debates, that has people riled up. It's something else. 3/4 of Americans believe that they spend too much on healthcare for what they get back. So it's about cost and value. And if you probe more deeply with data I'm not going to show here, what you find is the most salient healthcare issues are prescription drug costs, out-of-pocket payments generally, and pre-existing conditions and protections for people who have pre-existing conditions. So actually, if the candidates in those first 3 debates had been playing to what voters care about, they would have been talking about drugs and costs and pre-existing conditions. That's not what they were talking about, which tells you something about the dynamics of Democratic primaries. Now, Americans are actually pretty compassionate. If you ask them whether people have a right to health care coverage in the United States, they do believe that. And they believe also that people of different ethnicities and races have the same rights as the majority population. So these attitudes are pretty general and are not constrained by senses of racial or ethnic difference. And a slight majority of Americans believe that it is the federal government's responsibility to assure that people have health care coverage. This is data from, I believe, it's our own data. There you go. The Commonwealth Fund, Harvard School of Public Health, and the New York Times did a survey a few months ago and showed this particular result. At the same time, many Americans remain skeptical of new federal programs. So the same poll I just mentioned, the same survey, which we did with the New York Times and Harvard School of Public Health, which showed that people think the federal government should be responsible for making sure people have coverage, also don't believe that the federal government would do a good job of taking on that challenge, even though they also like the existing federal programs, Medicare and Medicaid. So obviously some inconsistency in people's views, but who said that humans have to be consistent in their views? This is the kind of landscape that our putative possible elected officials have to navigate when it comes to the development of healthcare policy. People should be covered, federal government should do it, but the federal government can't do it, but I like federal programs. And so how do you navigate that set of views? That is the subtext, by the way, I think, of the debates that you have watched and will be watching between Democratic candidates and ultimately between a Democrat and President Trump. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about some important work, I think, that we did at the Commonwealth Fund with partners at the Urban Institute. We modeled 8 prototypical healthcare policies to expand coverage. They ranged from a modest expansion of the Affordable Care Act all the way to Medicare for all. And 6 options in between of growing aggressiveness with respect to cost and the numbers of uninsured who would become newly insured. You are welcome to go to the website of the Commonwealth Fund. You can Google Commonwealth Fund Urban Institute. It'll take you right there. There are multiple ways of looking at those. There are multiple versions of the results with varying levels of complexity all the way down to all the infinite detail about the assumptions that went into this modeling exercise. It's very instructive. One basic bottom line that I'll share with you is that there are several ways to get to universal coverage in the United States. You don't have to do it through single payer. But if you don't do single payer, you have to find a way to enroll people whether they choose to be enrolled or not. And one way to do that is a tactic called auto-enrollment, which we can talk about some more if they're in question and answers. But there are several ways of doing it, and one way or another, you have to cover everybody, whether they choose to be covered or not. So that's the landscape in terms of public opinion. These are the options that have been laid out, or some of the options have been laid out. None of them are actually specific to candidates. I wish, and I was just talking with Joe Antos about this, I wish that we had some Republican equivalent ideas to model so that we could have some symmetry, starting with the ACA and going to the left and going to the right. Maybe that will still happen. We'd love to see it. But regardless of what the proposals are, if they mean change of any substantial magnitude, the political situation I'm about to describe to you will pertain. If you're talking about a public option or anything more as aggressive or more aggressive than that, I think the basic requirements for change are the following. Democratic control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. A Senate majority that is not just filibuster-proof, but could withstand the defection of several Democrats under pressure from providers who will object to the pay cuts, the reimbursement restrictions that are almost inevitable to be enacted as part of a public option. So you're talking 64 to 67 Democratic senators. This is for left of center change. If you wanted to do repeal and replace, I think you would need the same mirror image control by Republicans of the House, the Senate, with a sufficient Senate majority so that if you lose 2 or 3 moderate senators, you can withstand a filibuster. So I think there's a kind of symmetry to this. And the next thing you need is a president who knows what he or she is doing. To illustrate that, I'm going to talk about a presidential playbook. And I'm going to ask the question of, what did this guy do right? This is Lyndon Johnson signing Medicare in Independence, Missouri, with Harry Truman and Bess Truman by his side, Hubert Humphrey in the background. Some of us are old enough to remember these people when they were alive. For many of you in the room, these may be only historic figures. So what did this guy do right? What did this guy and his wife do wrong so that they weren't at a signing ceremony? And what did this guy do right? And by right here, I'm talking about success, not a moral or ethical judgment about right. What made them effective? So you have Johnson, Clinton, Obama. What's the difference between them? Lyndon Johnson was probably the most successful, judging by numbers of enacted pieces of legislation, the most successful domestic legislator who has ever occupied the White House, certainly a rival to Franklin Roosevelt. As you all know, he succeeded the assassinated John F. Kennedy and was president for about a year and a half before he was himself elected to his own term in office. He was elected by a massive landslide. I think 64%, somewhere between 60 and 64% of the votes. No shilly-shallying about majorities in that election. Within a few weeks of getting elected, he assembled his domestic staff in the White House and the assistant secretaries for legislation from throughout the federal government, people responsible for dealing with the Congress. And this is what he told them. Every day I'm in office, I'm going to lose votes. I'm going to alienate somebody. We've got to get this legislation fast. And by that he meant Medicare, not Medicaid, because no one had conceived of Medicaid at this point, but by that he meant Medicare and other domestic policy initiatives that he had in mind. He knew something that President Clinton didn't know and that Barack Obama learned, and that is that the healthcare presidency is 6 months long. This issue is so fraught, so politically difficult, so almost suicidal from a political standpoint, that if you want to take it on, you have to do it when your political capital is untainted and at its height. And the longer you wait, the less likely you are to be successful. And if you wait till you do something else that's controversial, your chances diminish dramatically for the reasons that Lyndon Johnson put his finger on. You lose votes. People get angry at you. They remember when you didn't do what you promised or they hoped you do, and they're no longer in your camp the way they would have been otherwise. So what does that mean what does a 6-month presidency mean for healthcare reform? It means that presidents have to act fast. That's sort of a tautology. It means they basically have to leave the inaugural podium with a plan. They don't have months to put a plan together. Now, I don't mean by plan a 100 or 300-page single-spaced piece of legislation. I mean a strategy and a set of guideposts and ideas or goals that are make or break for the president, and the ability to provide guidance to a Congress that will look to the president for guidance. Now, tracking back, to come with a plan means you've got to use the transition or the electoral campaign, but during electoral campaigns, few people have the mental space to think seriously about governing. You have to use the transition to put together a strategy for what you're going to do the first day you're in office on health care. And by the way, let's put health care aside. If it were climate change, or if it were tax reform, or whatever the major issue, it would the same question would pertain. And in fact, another implication is that if it's going to be health care, the president has to be all in for health care. It has to be his or her key priority. It has to be something they are willing to give up other things for. When Obama took office within a month or two. He was advised by virtually all his advisors not to do health care. And he decided to do it anyway. It was a personal decision. Don't know exactly why. Johnson felt pretty much the same way about health care. You can find 1,000 quotes in his tapes, his recorded conversations, discussing his deep felt, in very folksy Texas terms, his deep felt commitment to health care. People speculate that his commitment originated in work he did teaching Mexican-American children while he was in teachers college as a young man. Don't know exactly what it is, but, and he also, of course, had a number of personal encounters with health care while he was in the Congress and when he was in the Senate. Heart attacks, gallstones, you name it. He had a lot of health care issues. But he was all in on it, and so was Obama. Clinton, not so much. Clinton decided he would do NAFTA, remember NAFTA? To do NAFTA first and try to deal with the budget deficit before he got to health care. And people got really angry at him about NAFTA. There was a lot of trading and tough negotiation around NAFTA. He made a lot of enemies that came back to haunt him during the health care debate. So all in for health care. I should also say, since I mentioned transitions, that Johnson didn't need to do a lot of work in transitions because he had a bill. He had already been part of the effort during the Kennedy administration and then during his brief time in the presidency to pass a version of Medicare. It was actually a lousy bill, covered only hospital services and not that much of hospital services, but he had a bill that he could hold up for the Congress and say, this is what I want, this is what I stand for. He didn't need to do a lot of work. Obama also had a clear idea of what he wanted. He didn't have a plan, but he had a set of principles and ideas that he knew he wanted to use in his negotiations with the Congress. Clinton had detailed policy discussions during his transition in Little Rock about healthcare policy. A group of experts presented a kind of expert-informed healthcare coverage program that was modeled to some degree on previous plans, including one that was endorsed by Richard Nixon. And he threw it out because it wasn't different enough, and it wasn't an example of the new Democrat. They went back to the drawing board, and of course they spent many months trying to put together the perfect plan, wasted that 6 months in policy development, and then his plan was rejected outright when it became time to present it to the Congress. And lo and behold, he found out that the Congress didn't want the president to give them a bill. They wanted to draft their own. Next point I want to make is the president has to defer to the Congress. The president has to know to defer to the Congress. This is another lesson from Lyndon Johnson. If you listen to Lyndon Johnson's conversations with Senate and House leaders during the during the congressional processing of Medicare after the 1964 election, you will hear him tell the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, we'll call it your bill. Happened to be a guy named Wilbur Mills, said, we'll call it the Mills bill. I don't care what's in it. He literally said that. I don't care what's in it. Just got to cover old people for health care. I'll find the money. Don't worry about the money. I'll find it. Just do what you think is right, cover them, and I'll be behind you. And Wilbur Mills actually wrote the legislation with others, not him personally, but he and a guy named Wilbur Cohen wrote the legislation, added in Medicaid, which was not exactly on Johnson's screen at the time. but he was not unhappy with it. Clinton obviously didn't have that understanding of the Congress that Johnson had. Obama knew to do this because his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, had lived as part of the House leadership in the Congress, had lived through the Clinton reform and knew not to do what Clinton did. So he helped Obama see that he needed to present principles, guidelines, but not detailed legislation. And in fact, the Affordable Care Act was written in the Congress, mostly in the Senate, because of the vagaries of the legislative process. The House wrote a parallel bill, but it never got a chance to vote on it. I've already suggested another key lesson from Johnson, which is that presidents have to know to give away the credit. Now, what does that mean? That means they have to have sufficient control of their egos to say to Wilbur Mills, we'll call it the Mills Bill, knowing that history will give them the credit anyway. The Senate Finance Committee wrote the Affordable Care Act, now known irreverently in many circles as Obamacare. So whether the president wants it or not, he or she will be credited with the success or also with the failure. The last thing I think a president needs to know how to do is how to lose. Because in the process of passing any bill, from the right or from the left, there will be setbacks. Now, in the case of the Affordable Care Act, the single most important setback occurred after Ted Kennedy's death and the election of Scott Brown to the United States Senate from Massachusetts. That took the Senate, the Democratic majority from 60 votes to 59 votes. 60 votes is what they needed to break a Republican filibuster. They no longer had it. And the result was that they had to have the House vote on an already passed Senate bill and accept it every comma, every semicolon in order to avoid a conference, which they could, and they couldn't have passed the conference report because they didn't have a filibuster-proof majority. Now, there were people in the White House at that point in time who advised the president to fold up his tents and to just go for something modest. Let's cover children. Let's cover pregnant women. Something that was face-saving, useful, but not as ambitious as the Affordable Care Act. But the president had the courage to stay with it, with help from, of course, from Speaker Pelosi. And another person who knew how to lose was Harry Truman, who, despite significant defeats on this issue in 1948, continued to espouse national health insurance in the 1952 election and put it on the agenda for Democrats in the future. This is not something that Bill Clinton knew how to do. After the defeat of his Clinton health reform, he ran from health care for the remainder of his 6 years in office, as did the entire Democratic Party until President Obama ran for office. So let me wrap up at this point and say, I will leave it to you to calculate the odds that after 2021, in January of 2021, we will have this set of conditions present to enable major reform on the right or the left. One of the key things that you need to think about in that regard is the first one on this list: all in for health care. Will a new president or a re-elected president, want to go after this issue again while knowing the opportunity cost with respect to whatever Republican or Democratic priorities may be. For the Democrats, it would be tax reform, climate change, other environmental policy, maybe some things that people care about much more, prescription drug pricing reform, things way short of the big coverage extensions that we've been talking about. So the odds are whatever you think they're going to be. I'm not going to make predictions, but I do think that this is a realistic account of what the next 2 to 4 years hold for us with respect to the options and requirements for reform. So I'm going to stop my remarks there, Glenn, and I'd be happy to take questions if people are not too depressed to raise their hands.
Got about 10 minutes for questions. Go ahead. Sir, go ahead.
Okay, 2 questions. First of all, do you think that the candidates that are running now, that are espousing health care for all and various different, I'm thinking especially like this for whatever his name is, everyone's going to have insurance, everyone's, and you like it, you can keep it, and then you have, Liz and Bernie who were saying health care for all. Do you think they really think that they're going to get that, or are they just saying that to get people to vote for them?
Well, there are 8 or 10 of them, I lose count, and I don't pretend to know what's on their mind.
David, you don't mind using the microphone, that way we'll capture the audio.
Okay.
And also, I can't imagine, do you really?
So the simple answer to your first question is I don't know.
Is there any possibility that we're going to have a Democratic president, Democratic Congress, House, and Democratic Senate? What is the likelihood of that happening?
Well, I think that we could all have opinions about that, and I am not an election prognosticator. That's not, I'm a doctor, I went to medical school, I didn't get a degree in political science or whatever you need to have. I will say that historically speaking, those situations do not occur commonly.
So to possibly go in a slightly more optimistic note, if I agree, or well, if my takeaway from this set of inferences is pretty pessimistic, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on other sort of low-hanging fruit areas, or sort of other than major reform, if you think that's really implausible. What are the areas that we could realistically see a lot of meaningful progress?
Well, there are, I mentioned that we modeled 8 options, and some of them require very minimal changes to the Affordable Care Act. So I think it would be possible if a Democratic president wanted to expand coverage and to enrich the Affordable Care Act, build on it. There are 3 or 4 important things that they could do that would expand coverage by 8 to 10 million Americans. Not eliminate uninsurance, but reduce it. They include things like making the subsidies more generous and making them available to people with higher incomes than 400% of poverty. Really, middle-class Americans can't afford health insurance anymore unless they're employed. So having the subsidies is really important. The other is reinsurance, which has the effect of reducing premiums for everybody and making them more affordable for everybody. And some form of auto-enrollment with an opt-out is also, I think, something that, especially for people who are already enrolled in public programs. So if you're getting food stamps, if you're getting some form of public assistance, having health insurance, regardless of whether you ask for it or not, would be another way to expand. So there are these things you can do that don't sound like big deals, but reduce the number of uninsured by 4, 5, 6, 10 million.
I think it's Trotsky that the idea the worse the better has been ascribed, this idea that sometimes only when there are truly catastrophic events can you have a major change. I'm curious if you have a sense of what the worst would look like in healthcare that would change the political math here in some way. Whether you could imagine a kind of catastrophic event, a catastrophic set of numbers
Yeah.
would change the gravity.
Well, I'm not sure what would happen if the Supreme Court agreed that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. It would open the playing field if there was a new president and a new Congress for new things to happen. So I think that is the most proximate catastrophe. Not everyone would see it as a catastrophe, but from the standpoint of the left, the most proximate catastrophe that could open the gates to creative legislating, including fixing a lot of the problems with the Affordable Care Act. So I think it would be a really interesting test for the right side of the political spectrum to deal with that eventuality, and I suspect a number of them have heartburn about it because it would really test it would put them back where they were with repeal and replace. And I think conservatives had a lot of trouble come to agreement, just as the Democrats do, by the way, on what they ought to do next. But that would be the most short-term event. The longer-term event, I think, is hinted at by some data that the Commonwealth Fund has generated on what's happening to employer-sponsored insurance. Healthcare costs a lot. Premiums are high. Employers have been transferring costs onto their workforces steadily for a decade. The result is that insurance is less and less generous and less adequate. And the concern with costs that we are hearing about reflects to some degree the hollowing out of employer-sponsored insurance, as well as which reflects in turn the high cost of services and drugs. So I could imagine, and this is more of a 5 or 10-year scenario, enough Americans saying, I have insurance, but it's not worth anything, such that a federal alternative looks less risky and more attractive.
Great. One last question, very quick. Go ahead.
I took that question and wondered whether pandemic flu, with mortality, morbidity, and bankruptcy resulting, would be such a catastrophe. Maybe the opioid epidemic is a minor, version of what might happen if something like that happens. Catastrophic.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I don't know the answer to that. Real pandemic flu with lots of people dying, sorry to summon that idea or that vision, including many who don't have the money to afford care and therefore are not getting care, might change some attitudes. This is about a public risk-benefit calculation is what I have. So, and by the way, all the polls show that people are satisfied with their insurance. It may be lousy, but they're satisfied with it. What do I have? When does it get bad enough so I don't mind giving it up for some uncertain alternative? That's psychologically what we're dealing with, and we haven't reached that tipping point.
Great. Please join me in thanking Professor Blumenthal.